The Voice in the Mist. The small village of Estrada Velha was known for its tranquility, but also for a mystery that its residents avoided discussing: the mist that surrounded the nearby forest. Everyone knew that as night fell, a dense fog would spread across the streets closest to the trees, bringing with it a sense of unease. And if anyone dared to venture out on those nights, they claimed to hear a voice softly calling from within the haze. Marta had grown up hearing these stories. Her mother always warned her never to walk alone when the mist appeared. But like many young people, Marta didn't believe in local legends. To her, the stories were nothing more than exaggerations from superstitious villagers. That was until the night the mist crept up to her window, and a voice whispered her name. Marta. The sound was faint, almost like an echo, but clear enough to make her heart race. She looked out the window, but saw nothing beyond the thick fog that blanketed the street. Yet the voice felt close, strangely familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Marta. The voice called again, more insistent this time. Feeling a mixture of curiosity and fear, Marta stepped out onto her porch, trying to see through the mist. The air was cold, and the moisture seemed to press against her skin. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The only reply was silence, followed by faint laughter that seemed to come from all directions. Marta hesitated on the porch, her heart pounding as she strained to catch a glimpse of movement in the mist. The laughter faded, replaced by the same voice, now softer, almost pleading. "Marta, come." She took a step back, torn between heeding her mother's warnings and the strange pull of the voice. Deep down, she knew she should go back inside, lock the door, and wait for the mist to pass. But something about that voice kept her rooted to the spot. It was unsettling yet familiar, as if it belonged to someone she knew, someone who needed her. "Who are you?" Marta called out, her voice shaking. For a moment, the mist seemed to part slightly, and Marta saw a shadow move in the distance, something human. Her heart leapt, and she ran toward the figure. "Anna, is that you?" As she drew closer, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the mist like a fleeting reflection. Marta stopped, breathless, looking around in confusion. The mist seemed thicker now, and the oppressive feeling of being watched settled heavily over her. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, this time directly behind her. "Do not be afraid." She spun around, but there was no one there. The silence was deafening. Marta's breathing quickened, and a growing sense of dread clawed at her chest. She forced herself to keep moving, following the faint sound of rustling leaves and branches, until she stumbled upon a hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing, Marta saw something that made her freeze. Hanging from a low branch was an old doll, swaying gently as if left there for her. The doll was unmistakable. It belonged to Anna, her younger sister, who had disappeared years ago during a misty night just like this one. With trembling hands, Marta picked up the doll. The cold she felt when touching it was unbearable, and the moment her fingers wrapped around it, the voice whispered again. "You found me, but now there is no turning back." Before she could react, the mist around her came alive. Dark shapes emerged from all directions, shadows with empty eyes that watched her in silence. Marta tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The mist enveloped her completely, and the last thing she heard was the soft, familiar laughter of the voice that had led her there. The next morning, the mist had vanished, and the village awoke to its usual quiet. But Marta was never seen again. Some villagers claimed to have heard her name whispered in the mist before it dissipated, while others swore they saw shadows moving through the forest that night. The clearing where Marta disappeared remained unchanged, except for the old doll hanging from the branch, swaying gently as a chilling reminder of that fateful evening. Sometimes, travelers passing through the area reported hearing faint laughter or someone calling out a name in the distance. But no one dared venture into the mist. And so, the mystery of the mist continued. It always returned, always called, and always waited for another to answer its voice. Years passed, and the villagers of Estrada Velha learned to live with the mist as part of their lives, a shadowy presence that came and went without warning. The story of Marta became a cautionary tale, whispered to children as a reminder to never walk into the fog. But despite the warnings, there were always those who were drawn to it, unable to resist the faint whispers that seemed to call out specifically to them. Some claimed the mist was alive, a force that fed on the lost and broken, using their memories to lure others into its grasp. Others believed it was a gateway to a place beyond understanding, where those who entered were trapped forever. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the mist never stopped calling. Late one evening, many years after Marta's disappearance, the mist returned, rolling in thicker than it had in decades. As it crept into the streets of the village, a new voice began to call from within. It was soft, hesitant, and unmistakably familiar. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" The villagers who heard it froze in fear, recognizing the voice of Marta, long thought lost to the mist. Some whispered that she had become part of it. Another voice added to its eternal chorus, forever luring others into its depths. And as the mist thickened, spreading through the forest and streets, the villagers locked their doors and windows, praying that no one would be foolish enough to answer its call. Yet they knew deep down that the mist would always find another. In the days following the mist's return, Estrada Velha was gripped by a tense silence. People spoke in hushed tones, and no one dared venture near the forest. Those who lived closest to the trees claimed they could still hear Marta's voice calling softly at night, her tone shifting between pleading and warning. "Don't come. Stay away." But others swore they heard another voice layered beneath hers, deeper, colder, and more commanding. This voice didn't beg, it beckoned. One restless evening, a young man named Daniel, who had grown up hearing the stories of the mist but never fully believing them, decided to investigate. Daniel was skeptical by nature, and like Marta before him, he dismissed the villagers' superstitions as fear of the unknown. Armed with a lantern and a determination to prove the stories wrong, he walked toward the forest as the mist began to rise. The air grew colder with each step, the light from his lantern swallowed by the thickening fog. The village lights behind him faded until he was surrounded entirely by the mist's oppressive presence. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his bravado. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faint and distant, came the sound of laughter, followed by Marta's voice. "Go back! It's not safe." But another voice followed, dark and resonant. "Keep going, Daniel. She's waiting for you." Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't told anyone he was coming here. How could the mist know his name? Against his better judgment, he pressed forward, the lantern trembling in his hand. Shapes began to form in the mist, fleeting shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. Soon, he reached the clearing where the doll still hung from the low branch, its threadbare body swaying gently as though stirred by an unseen force. As Daniel approached, he felt the weight of countless unseen eyes upon him. The mist seemed alive, shifting and writhing as whispers surrounded him, voices layered atop one another, too many to discern. In the center of it all, Marta's voice cried out, "Leave! It's a trap!" But before Daniel could react, the shadows surged toward him, and the lantern's flame extinguished. The next morning, the mist was gone, as though it had never been there. The villagers searched for Daniel, but no trace of him was found. Only the doll, now lying on the ground where it had once hung. The whispers in the village grew louder. Some believed Daniel had been taken by the mist, just as Marta had been. Others whispered that the mist was growing stronger, its reach extending further, its hunger never satisfied. And so, the legend of Estrada Velha deepened, the mist continuing its endless cycle, calling for the curious, the lost, and the brave, always waiting for someone to answer its voice. As the years passed, Estrada Velha became a place of whispered caution and haunting memories. The villagers spoke less and less of those who vanished into the mist, their names gradually fading into the folds of silence. But the stories never truly disappeared. They lingered like the mist itself, ever present and waiting. No one ventured into the forest anymore, not even out of curiosity. When the mist rolled in, doors were bolted, windows sealed, and prayers murmured softly into the dark. Still, the voices came, soft and insistent, calling out to those who dared to listen. "Come, find me." The clearing in the forest remained untouched, an eerie reminder of those who had been lured and lost. The doll, once a simple relic of a vanished girl, became a marker of the mist's reach, now tangled in roots and covered in moss, as though the forest itself was claiming it. For the villagers, the mist was no longer just a weather pattern. It was a presence, a force beyond their understanding. And though they avoided it, they knew the mist would always return. It needed no reason, no invitation. It simply came, shrouding the world in its oppressive embrace, waiting for its next victim. Estrada Velha endured, the people adapting to their strange coexistence with the mist. And yet, on particularly still nights, when the fog crept silently through the trees, some claimed they could hear faint whispers carried on the wind. Marta's voice was among them, forever part of the mist, warning and calling all at once. "Don't come. It's too late." But the mist never truly warned. It beckoned, it lured, it waited, and for as long as there were those who listened, the mist would remain, eternal, silent, and hungry. The Forgotten Hotel. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip. The GPS had me driving through an old highway, promising it was the fastest route. The storm came out of nowhere, rain hammering the windshield and blurring the road until I could barely see. When I spotted the old hotel sign flickering in the distance, Grand Haven Inn, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The place looked like it had been plucked out of another century, its facade worn and cracked. But with the storm worsening, I didn't have much choice. The lobby smelled of mildew and age. Behind the desk stood a man with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes. He smiled faintly as I approached. "Welcome to the Grand Haven Inn," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Staying the night?" I nodded. He handed me an old-fashioned brass key, its number, 306, engraved on the tag. "Enjoy your stay," he added, though his tone lacked sincerity. As I climbed the creaking stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The room was surprisingly clean. The bed was neatly made, and a faint floral scent lingered in the air. But there were peculiarities. The mirror over the dresser was cracked, spiderweb fractures running across its surface. The wallpaper peeled in places, revealing strange symbols etched into the wood beneath. I ignored the oddities and locked the door. I just needed to rest until morning. At midnight, the phone rang. Groggy, I stumbled out of bed and answered it. "Hello?" There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice rising. A woman's voice finally spoke, soft and trembling. "Don't leave your room, no matter what you hear." Before I could respond, the line went dead. Minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that demanded attention. "Hello?" I called out, my heart racing. No answer. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. Ignoring the warning, I unlocked the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. As I turned to close the door, I saw her, a woman standing at the end of the hallway. Her dress was tattered, her hair hanging in matted clumps. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She raised a hand, pointing directly at me, then whispered something I couldn't hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Suddenly, the lights flickered and she vanished. Panicked, I decided to leave. But as I descended the stairs, I heard voices coming from the lobby. It was filled with people now, their clothes outdated, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't notice me at first, but as I reached the bottom step, they all turned to look at me in unison. Their eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to suck the air out of the room. The man from the front desk appeared, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he said. "What's happening here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "This hotel doesn't let people leave," he said simply. "It hasn't for decades." I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my mind racing. I noticed something I hadn't before, a photo hanging on the wall. It was a group picture of the hotel staff and guests, dated 1932. My blood ran cold when I saw myself in the back row, staring directly at the camera. Desperate, I threw my belongings into a bag and climbed out the window, landing in the muddy grass below. The storm had stopped, but the air was thick with fog. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally got the engine started, I sped away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I reached a gas station miles down the road that I stopped to catch my breath. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside. "You okay?" he asked. I just stayed at the Grand Haven Inn," I said, still trembling. His expression darkened. "That place burned down 50 years ago." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "That's not possible. I was just there." He shook his head. "You're not the first person to say that." When I returned to my car, I found something sitting on the passenger seat. The brass key to room 306. Scratched into its surface were the words, "Come back soon." The engine wouldn't start again, and as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the hotel in the distance, its lights flickering, waiting for me.